much. It's a big honor to be here today. I want to start with just a little bit of a personal story. My wife is of Ukrainian extraction, and our first son, rather large child. He was born 10 pounds, 15 ounces. And so my wife had this experience where she was shopping in a kosher grocery when my son was just a little baby boy. By the way, now he's all grown up and he's still massive. He's training to be in the special forces of the Israel Defense Forces right now. So I think he takes more after my wife's side of the family. Anyway, she was pushing him in the stroller in this grocery store with only Jewish customers there, and there were a couple of Soviet Jewish immigrants who were in the store, and they started talking with my wife about the little baby, and they asked how old he was. They thought he was maybe 2 years old. She said, no, he was born like a few months ago. And they clapped their face and they said, Oi, Bogdan Khmelnytskyi. In the context of that moment, they now realize, of course, my wife understood exactly what they're saying. For them, Khmelnytskyi was like something big and horrible and terrible and, oh my gosh, monstrous. How could a woman give birth to a child who was born 10 pounds 15? So that really speaks to the heart of our conversation today, which is about monuments that are dedicated to individuals with mixed heritage and are viewed very differently by Jews and Ukrainians in particular. I think my esteemed members of the panel might enjoy this presentation more if you shift it around, because it has lots of photographs and films and things like that. And I will try very hard to stay on time. So the zeitgeist, I mean, unless you have been living under a rock for the last year or so, you know that this country has been rocked with controversy over monuments in Charlottesville, Virginia, and other places. In particular, monuments like this one in Charlottesville that are dedicated to the Southern Civil War hero, Robert E. Lee. And many people, of course, feel that these monuments are essentially tributes to slavery and they should be destroyed. And we've had horrible violence erupt in this country as a result, including the death of a young woman at this particular presentation when a protester who was protesting the protest against the, it was originally well, I don't have to tell you all the details because it's not important for us today, we're talking about Ukraine, but nevertheless the idea of removing statues that offend a certain segment of the population is something which is very much au courant in today's society. We also have a Jewish interpretation of this, and that's what gave me the inspiration for this particular talk. This is from a recent publication that came out a couple of months ago from the Forward. The Jewish Forward is one of the oldest and most mainstream Jewish publications in the world. It was originally published in Yiddish as their Vorwärts. It was left-leaning. Today it is published in an English and in a Yiddish edition still, but it's sort of center-left nowadays. And it's one of the more mainstream publications, a little slightly left. And you can see this article by Avital Goldschmidt says, why these 5 statues of rabid anti-Semites are still standing. She's arguing that way, why should we be so focused on Charlottesville? We have our own controversies in the Jewish world. And if you're curious about these 5 statues, of course, we have a king from England from the 13th century when the Jews were expelled from the city of York. And below that, you have Ferdinand and Isabella, remembering the 15th century expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. And then moving over here, we have Martin Luther, an interesting character in that he originally was very close to the Jews, but when they failed to convert to Protestantism because he felt that a more rational form of Christianity would attract the Jews, then he ended up writing von der Juden und ihre Lügen, about the Jews and their lies. So rather nasty individual that way. But that's the top 3, but making it into the top 5 are 2 Ukrainians, Bogdan Khmelnytskyi and Shevchenko Petliura, who's of course very significant for us today on the anniversary of the revolution. So we have 2 Ukrainian figures who are in the top 5 of the quote-unquote rabid anti-Semites that should be, their monuments should be removed. That's the topic for debate that Ms. Goldschmidt places in the pages of the forwards. So this is nothing new. As my father of blessed memory used to always say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The idea of removing monuments is historically as old as, or almost as old as putting up monuments. We have, of course, the iconoclast movement, which was dedicated to this. We all experienced this during the heady days of the early 1990s, Soviet Union. We are enjoying a contemporary version with ISIS, which is especially fond of destroying historical artifacts that they believe are associated with non-Muslim worship. We have American versions as well, going back to tearing down statues of various kings and foreign occupations, Saddam Hussein and so on. So this is certainly nothing new. The idea of creating a monument and then the individual for whom it is created falls out of favor, and so we decide to remove it. However, we get to a kind of unusual point where how far does this go? And ironically, I find myself in agreement with none other than Donald Trump. Let's have a look at this short clip. So this is the, he has a point, as Taka, he has a point, as my grandmother of blessed memory would say. Where does it stop? How do we find a point to decide that such an individual, that the bulk of the assessment of his or her life achievements are simply not commensurate with the monumentalization that we have engaged in? So, let's look specifically to the Ukrainian situation, where we'll focus, one more point on Jewish memorializations. Of course, statues are significant for Jews as well. This is a very moving photograph with a moving monument in the background. It's, of course, located at Villainy. But Jews do not have a long history with statues themselves. It's kind of a side point. We have this irritating passage in the Bible. It's one of the 10 Commandments about no graven images, and as a result there's been a hesitancy in Jewish history to actually form three-dimensional images. There have been individuals, some famous sculptors, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, but it's sort of been something that's been held back by Jews. We do have a longer tradition of two-dimensional images. It stretches back with gaps to the ancient period, but this, for example, memorialization is much more traditional. It's at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and it is a seemingly infinite cone of photographs, which conveys, I think, in a very powerful way, the memorialization of the Holocaust. So we don't have the same kind of problem as much with Jews, with the exception of one that, of course, is connected to Petliura. So recently, also in the Forward and many other Jewish publications, there was quite an outcry over the erection of this statue, a rather beautiful one, I think, commemorating Petliura. This one happens to be, I believe, in Villainy. You can see the blue and yellow flowers, very appropriate colors and so on. And there's quite a bit of hoo-ha surrounding the opening of this particular exhibit. You can see the replication of World War I uniforms and a certain amount of marching and Centaurian presentations regarding the life of Petliura and so on, and marking him in this particular fashion. So Jews were very upset because Petliura is viewed as a pogromist by Jews. Now, as we heard in the first presentation, very well presented, it's not a fair characterization. I got into a lot of trouble when I published my book on the revolution 20 years ago. In fact, there were 2 master's dissertations written criticizing my approach. One in particular occasioned a very nasty debate in the pages of a journal called Revolutionary Russia. I was accused of being a Ukrainian apologist. I know you can tell from the way I look that I'm a Ukrainian apologist. But, it would be appropriate to delve deeper into the specific history that's a little bit outside of the chosen topic of my presentation, but let me just take one sentence to say that my take on Petliura, which I believe has been pretty much vindicated over the last 20 years of scholarship, was that he was not, as historians of a Jewish persuasion after the 1920s have argued, for reasons I will show shortly, he was certainly not the architect of the pogroms. One cannot use the same kind of paradigms that we would use for, let's say, Adolf Hitler, God forbid, and apply that to Simon Petliura. He was more, as Alexander would put it, he was more kind of like a victim of the geopolitical circumstances. To argue that he in any way encouraged the pogroms would be not only doing a disservice to the limited archival documentation that we have, but also it would be a tremendous folly because it just didn't fit with what he was trying to achieve and the long record that we have of his very philo-Semitic statements that go back well before the revolution. What he could, and where I took heat from some Ukrainians, was that I argued that the measures that he took were somewhat too late and perhaps not as forceful as they could have been. And I'm talking about a period of perhaps 3 weeks. 3 weeks of indecision in which the fledgling government was fleeing from forces on them from all sides. And perhaps if you're to take issue with Petliura and the pogroms, it would be in those 3 weeks of indecision, but no more. At any rate, when Jews look at Petliura, though, they look at him something like this famous Ilyarepin representation of the Zaporozhian Kozake, who are, Ukrainians, I believe, see this picture and they see like fun-loving, beer-drinking, happy-go-lucky, cowboy-type individuals, whereas Jews look at this and just want to run. And the first time I saw in Kyiv a big man wearing a Cossack-style mustache, I was terrified. I mean, some kind of genetic response was triggered in me that said, I have to leave this place right now. And so we have a very different reaction to the same kind of phenomenon. Same thing goes with Petliura. For Jews, he is one of these arch criminals, and for Ukrainians, he is a poetic hero of the resistance that unfortunately failed in 1919. So, with regards to Petliura, there's one more very difficult thing that we have to consider. I've already spoken about, after all, he was a literary figure. He was a journalist. He was a playwright. He was not by nature a military man, although it is interesting to note the tremendous number of people who rose in integral nationalist movements who were actually of this persuasion earlier. But what complicates the story of Petliura is his assassination in 1926 by Shalom Schwarzbart, shown here in his mugshot photo from Paris. As the story goes, I'm sure everyone in this audience is aware, Petliura was living in exile in Paris, and he had just left a cafe, and Schwarzbart, who claimed that his family had been harmed in some of the pogroms by Ukrainian troops, which was not far-fetched, but it's also not far-fetched to see that he had many connections with the Soviet government. That's a whole story in itself. At any rate, he walked up to him, he said, "Vous êtes Monsieur Petliura?" He said, "Oui." He pulled out a gun and he shot him dead on the spot. In the trial that ensued, that was global significance, it actually made the New York Times several times. The argument that was made in that Paris court was that Schwarzbart was acting as an avenger for the pogroms. And amazingly, even though it was clearly a case of cold-blooded murder in the street, Schwarzbart was acquitted. His wife, Petliura's wife and orphan were given a franc each in damages. And this was viewed in the Jewish world as a tremendous vindication of the suffering of the Jews, and it was in fact viewed as a great victory. Here's an example of how the great painter Marc Chagall put it. This is a very evocative image. You can see there is a Torah scroll. This has a religious connotation to it. The word written in Yiddish on the scroll is simply the name Schwarzbart, as if he is the word of God, so to speak. And flying above him is the avenging angel of death, reminiscent of the 10 plagues. So the whole thing taken together is one that Jews worldwide felt that finally someone had stood up for the honor of the Jews and had assassinated the pogromist Petliura. It was historically inaccurate, but that really has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, which is more about memory than about history. Here's another example of memorialization. As I mentioned, we're not too big into statues, but we are very big into naming streets. Maybe I can even tell a small joke, because we talk so much about pogroms. It's so nasty to have time. Yes, I can tell a very small joke. The joke goes like this. I don't know if any of you will get it. It might be too Jewish, but I'll tell you anyway. The joke goes like this, that there's a Hadassah group in Margate, Florida, and they've raised a lot of money to donate a fighter jet to the Israeli Armed Forces. Tremendous amount of money. So they have a big ceremony right there on the tarmac. They put up these bleachers. I'm laughing thinking about the joke. And they set up on the bleachers, and they have this big F-15 fighter, and the Israeli IDF pilot comes out, and he salutes everyone in the bleachers, and he climbs up into the cockpit, pulls down the cowling, fires up the engines, and it races down the runway, and it stops. Turns it around, fires up the engines, races down the runway, it stops. This happens a few times. Finally, he taxis up to the bleachers, opens up the cowling, and gets out. He walks up to the president of the Hadassah, and he says to her, "The plane will not take off. We have to remove at least some of the plaques." Anyways, this is a street sign, the equivalent of a plaque on a municipal level, and it says Hanokim in Hebrew. The word Hanokim means the avenger, Shalom Schwarzbart, the avenger of all these things. So, looking at these memorials, such as that of Petliura or that of Khmelnytskyi, which we haven't talked about at all, we see that we're still mired in many of the controversies of that era. Not only was Petliura viewed, I think, by Jews with a much more moderate eye before the Schwarzbart trial. After Schwarzbart's trial, the historiography really went off the rails. I discuss it, if you're curious, in my 1999 book on this topic. So we're left kind of with a question for debate. And so I'd like to take us to New York for a couple of solutions. This issue, of course, crosses all cultures. And just recently, last week actually, Mayor de Blasio, when confronted with a few very strong arguments from minority groups about memorials that were offensive, he took essentially three basic positions. So let's have a look at these. This is really contemporary news. First off, the memorial that's dedicated to J. Marion Sims, who was a very pioneering scientist and gynecologist. De Blasio agreed with the activist groups representing several minorities in New York City that the fact that he operated on women against their will was sufficiently offensive that they would remove this statue from where it currently stands in a public forum, and it will be placed in the graveyard where Sims is actually buried. So it's not being destroyed, but it will actually be moved to a less prominent place, because obviously placement of these statues is highly important. I think in that the statue of Petliura in Venezia, one of the most fascinating things about it, perhaps more problematic, is it's apparently about 200 yards away from the local synagogue. And that's difficult. The specific placement of it, may be a little bit too nasty. Second possibility is to contextualize. So this is, of course, we've all seen this statue of Columbus, who is controversial for so many reasons. And rather than removing this iconic piece of monumental architecture, de Blasio argued that they would be adding some more plaques. So the plane will not be able to take off, but at least there will be more information about some of the darker side of the Columbian exchange and so on. That's also, I think, an option that could be considered by Ukrainians and Americans as well. And finally, we can simply ignore the controversy. And this is much to the dismay of the Jewish world. There is a small foot plaque in Lower Manhattan that's dedicated to Henri-Philippe Pétain, the Grand Marshal of Vichy France, of course, a collaboratist organization that actually sent Jews to the concentration camps. Even before Hitler asked France to do so, Pétain had volunteered his Jews. So de Blasio has simply not taken up the question of what to do with this offensive flag. Because, you know, we don't know how far it's going to go. Soon they'll be moving plaques of George Washington. At any rate, that's just a quick overview of some of the problematics. I hope this will be fruitful for our future debate, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today.